and welcome to this virtual event hosted by Upper House, a project of the Stephen and Laurel Brown Foundation located in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm Dan Hummel, one of the program curators on staff at Upper House. Upper House is a Christian study center on the campus of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and our mission is to welcome anyone who longs to explore the life of the mind and the questions of the soul here in Madison and through these virtual events around the globe. Today, we're excited to host this virtual conversation on science and faith in times of crisis between Greg Cootsona, a scholar of religious studies, and Ben McFarland, a professor of chemistry. Both are Christians and have made it a part of their careers to publicly contemplate how their expertise and their faith intersect. We know, of course, that during the COVID-19 pandemic, good scientific information is at a premium. For Christians, so too is confidence in God's faithfulness. Greg and Ben will be exploring the complementary roles the two can play in this time of crisis. Together, they will discuss how to interpret science through a theological lens, from the science of chemical evolution, that is Ben's research focus, to the science of viral transmission and disease that we now encounter in our daily news. A few housekeeping items before we begin. We do anticipate a time of Q&A after the main conversation, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send questions our way. Second, the chat is turned off for this event, but it will be used to highlight a few of the resources connected to Ben and Greg's conversation and to the work that they do. And finally, during the bulk of the conversation, I will recede from view and turn my video and mic off. And then once we move into Q&A, I'll be back and you'll see the three of us on your screen. With that, let me introduce Greg, who will be guiding the conversation today. Greg Cootsona is a scholar, pastor, and author. He is a lecturer in religious studies and humanities at Chico State University, and before that, he was a pastor for 18 years. Greg has authored multiple books, including Negotiating Science and Religion in America, which is out this week. Greg is also a co-founder of Science for the Church, a new national initiative using science to invigorate the church, and has been a friend of Upper House's for many years. We're delighted to be partnering with Greg and with Science for the Church on this event. So Greg, welcome.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be a part of this event.
Greg, could you just get us started by any introductory remarks you want, and then introducing Ben as well?
Well, just to say briefly, I'm really thankful to be part of this event with Upper House and the partnership with Upper House and the organization that I co-direct, Science for the Church, is just tremendously important to me. And I think right now in this COVID-19 time, understanding how our faith and how great science, robust faith and great science come together is really important. And for that reason, I think it's wonderful we have Ben McFarland with us today. So I'm really excited to talk with him about that.
Great. Could you introduce Ben for us?
Absolutely. I'll do a formal introduction, and then we'll have stuff that comes out as we talk. So Ben McFarland is professor of biochemistry and chair of the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at Seattle Pacific University. He studies structural aspects of protein biochemistry and design. He writes about science for the general audiences. He also does videos regularly. I was just watching Ben last night, or this morning, excuse me, for his April 28th update on COVID-19 that you can find through YouTube. He's written a book with Oxford University Press called The World from Dust, How the Periodic Table Shaped Life. And it's been really fun to get to know Ben over the past couple of years, but particularly as we have focused on this event, to hear his story and his really colorful and poetic ways that he describes his scientific work. He loves words as much as he loves the structures of chemicals. So Ben, welcome to this time, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thanks, Greg. It's great to be here.
Well, so what we'll do is, as you know, we'll talk for a few, quite a bit, and then we'll be taking questions from the online audience toward the end of our time. And I want to make sure we cover 4 topics today, your background, because it's always fascinating to hear how somebody comes to do their calling, essentially, and then talk more specifically about your love for science, go into some of the book that you've written, A World from Dust, and then finish off and make sure we have enough time for your work with COVID-19, which of course is such a pressing issue for all of us. So why don't we start at the beginning? Why did you get interested in science, and what does it mean for you to have grown up in the so-called Space Coast in Florida?
Yeah, that's really formative for me. I basically grew up in Florida, and it's where I went to high school, and it's where I went to college, University of Florida, Florida Gators, all that SEC football stuff.
Absolutely.
So you have the whole region, and Florida, everyone knows that Florida's a unique state, right? You have the whole Florida man joke, right? And I guess I'm part Florida man. But it comes down to Florida has a lot of good things in it, as well as all the weirdnesses that come out of Florida. And so the weird area that I lived in the same county as the place where they sent off the space shuttles. So it was very normal for me to, all my friends' parents worked for the industry. My church had a lot of people who worked for it. And at school, of course, there was a lot of emphasis on science as well. And this played out in the events being really close to home. One of the things that was definitely unplanned and unanticipated, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded after it went up, and we were all actually out on the playground. I was in elementary school, I was in 6th grade, and they took us all out to watch it. Even though the shuttle launches had become sort of routine, that one was special for us because it had Krista McAuliffe, who was the first teacher in space there.
Right. Yeah.
And that was a really, didn't realize just how formative it was. It was formative for everyone in the whole country. If you look at the way people talk about it now, who are my generation,
it's one of those events that marked, American history, I think, right? And also gave us a sense of vulnerability, even in our technological progress, but also that, human interest story with Krista McAuliffe, where, wow, we could have been that person. It's more of an every person, right, in that way. But it had a particular effect on you and your family. Isn't that right, Ben?
Yeah, because it was local, and my dad worked in the industry. It had repercussions for the whole economy. And so when you have the space program shut down while they're figuring out what went on, the whole economy went into a tailspin, and there was not job security for pretty much anyone in the area. And that affected everyone, including myself and my family.
Yeah.
I went through that, it was kind of like I was always really interested in science. They had something called the Space Congress, okay? I'm not sure where they got that name, but it was basically a science fair and industry thing of the space, and they would bring people there. And because I was involved in the science research, I was doing little science projects of my own, and I would come and present it there. And then they'd have these big rocket mock-ups and things like that. And that was all just normal to me.
Yeah.
But the whole thing is, there was sort of a dual-edged part to it. I was always brought up around science, and thinking analytically was sort of in the water, but I never really trusted science as the source of security, because that was not my experience. My experience was that, what's working one day might not work the next day.
Right.
And that ended up with me, I think it's actually good that I didn't trust science to be the source of my security in that sense. We also were part of a church, and I think I ended up trusting the church more, and seeing that the community there and God working through that community provided the security that I needed that science would not provide.
Right. Well, I think that's such a significant thing, that for your life, science and faith have been wound together, especially your commitment to Jesus Christ and to the Christian faith. But I have a little of a less deep question for you. So Star Trek or Star Wars, and why?
Star Trek, you know, and I have a friend who won't even speak the name of Star Wars, and he sort of influenced me. Star Trek, definitely, because, well, first of all, Star Trek sort of made predictions that sort of came true because it was based on science. They actually have a reasonable theory of warp speed and faster than light travel, although honestly, it's still paradoxical. And so I have my doubts whether we'll actually be able to do that part of Star Trek.
Right.
But the tricorders, you know, you have the communicators. Everyone has their own communicator now.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I've got to say Star Trek for sure.
There's something else. We had this question and answer that now we've put onto the website at scienceforchurch.org. And one of the things you wrote I found really, really fascinating. I think it only makes it into the longer form. You said this as you were looking and growing in your understanding of your scientific fields, especially in college. I just kept taking the chemistry courses because there was something about the field that just clicked for me. I like the chemical structures with their weird shapes and bonds. I like the idea that you could click atoms together like little Legos and make a pharmaceutical that would heal a disease. I love that image. And I love the way, as we've been talking, that you play with words as much as you also ponder the deep, issues of structures in science and in chemistry and biochemistry. Can you tell us a little bit more about how those structures fit together and how that helped you move into this calling of being a scientist?
Sure. The thing about chemistry is we reduce it to atoms and electrons. You can take them apart, you can put them back together, and then there's things like energy, which is kind of a really weird concept if you start to look at it. What does energy actually mean? Because energy is not a thing really, it's more of a process. So there's all these things, but when I use the words, the idea of being able to break down things to these elements that, unless you're a physicist with a atom smasher or something like that, you can't really get below those elements. And then you can take those and you can put them together. I don't know if you can sort of see in my office here, there's Legos on the shelf. I don't know if you can see sort of on that shelf right there.
Right.
So I always love Legos, and it's kind of like real life Legos with a real life sort of result that can happen from it.
Right. That's fascinating. And again, I love the way that in your book, you do so much with creating images and ideas that can help us, help us who are not specialists in the field, right, to grasp it. But before we go there, I'm excited to talk about it. I did want to just move into a little bit more about your experience in the church. And that's been my particular work for really now about 10 years with various projects with my colleague, Drew Rick Miller, and I have really sought to bring together mainstream science and robust faith because of the ability for that to bring spiritual growth in congregations. And part of what we've found is that one of the most important things is for us to say to scientists, what you do is a Christian vocation, is a calling from God. And so I'd really be interested to hear how that calling has been a part of your life in the church, to what degree you've ever felt that you were not welcomed as a scientist, and to what degree the church has helped you develop into that calling. So if you want to take parts of that, let me know, and I'll come back to, because there's a couple parts of that question. But essentially, it's your calling as a Christian into the sciences. What's that been like, and how has the church community been a part of that?
Yeah. Sort of the methods of science have always been, I felt that there was not really a conflict between the methods of science and being a Christian in the church. I never really felt ostracized, so the conflict was more internal of me trying to apply this chemistry, what I really liked about chemistry. And as I was figuring out what I liked about chemistry, this whole atomic interpretation of life, right? But that has its ups and downs, and one of the ups and downs is, how do you interpret this relative to God's action as described in the Bible? It seems like you can go one way and say completely literal, every word, the way I interpret it when I first read it is the way it happened. And then you can go the other way and you can say, oh, it's all a metaphor. But that doesn't give you anything to hold on to, and that you can't find security. I talked about security before. A metaphor doesn't really make you secure. It doesn't answer the deep longing that you have for your location, your purpose, your direction in the world. Right. So I was always trying to negotiate that, and it was more internal than external. But I went through several phases. I went through even a young earth creationist phase where I was like, it says a day, that means 24 hours day, Right. I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I wasn't reading the original words that was there. I was sort of interpreting it through the lens of my conservative church community.
Right. And just to insert really quickly that one of the things is, of course, the word yom in Hebrew, as you well know, can mean day, 24-hour day, or a period of time. So there is that, when we first read it off the page in English, we think, okay, 24-hour day, but we may not see some of the ways in which there is an ability to connect with mainstream science and the kind of science that you study.
Yeah. It's the question of, God spoke the universe into creation. He spoke it into existence. He continues to uphold it and sustain it. That's what seems to me the fundamental insight of creation. And then how he continues to speak through those words, the yom word, the day word when I read it in English. Faith is sort of knowing that he's speaking.
Right.
But I think there's a humility that has to be open to how is he speaking right now.
Right. Well, and I think what you've done really well is you've maintained, it's not like you've had a good experience in your church world. And I know you're in a church in the Seattle area, Bethany Community Church, which is engaged in, taking the scripture seriously as well as taking mainstream science seriously. So, and I've seen you with your pastor having conversations about doing that right now in this time we're in. And I'm now nudging myself into the COVID-19 thing, but I did have something that I thought would be kind of interesting to touch on. Two phrases for our conversation. I wrote them down as hermeneutics and Pascal's wager. So let me see if this lands from our conversation.
Sure.
So as you know, Pascal's wager, Blaise Pascal, the 17th century scientist, said that if we're going to wager in life on God's existence or not on God's existence, why not wager on God? Because with God, you get eternal life, you get happiness now and forevermore. If you're right, the outcome is amazing. If you're wrong, it's much better than being wrong about not choosing God, right? And so somehow I've taken that and broadened it, I think, to come in my own philosophy that we have an essential wager we make on life. Either there's meaning and direction and purpose and a God who's given this world those things of meaning, direction, purpose, love, and all the important values, or there's not. And what makes more sense of the world to believe in that first, where there's meaning, purpose, a God who created us and loves us, or a purposeless, kind of random Jean-Paul Sartre, drink your dark black coffee with peg leg jeans or something and talk about the abyss, which I've read a lot and I studied that. Anyway, the point being, that's the kind of Pascal's wager, which moves into hermeneutics. Because hermeneutics is the interpretation of texts, interpretation of various things that are in front of us. So I remember when we were talking in the past week or two, you were saying that in a lot of ways, science has a kind of hermeneutic to it, that we can look at the data from, say, biochemistry in the periodic table or from geology, et cetera, and say, wow, it's just one thing after the other. Or we can also look at it and see the incredible structures. So this is an entree to your book, but I want to see, did I get you right? Do we vibe on that idea of, it does partially come down to how we approach the data that's given us?
Yes. The remarkable fact about Pascal's wager is the fact that everyone has a wager to set. You've been sort of given the coins with which to make a wager, and your experience as you go through life. And there's it's a choice, and it's a constant choice that we continue to face every day. And it's not an obvious choice.
Yeah.
That's why it's a wager, you know?
Yeah.
But I think the fact that we're in a place where we can make a wager, where we can wonder about it, it does lead to this question of, okay, what's the real fundamental bedrock of reality?
Yeah.
Like I talked about how because of my enjoyment of science, I like to play with it and it's always fun to me. But because of my experience with science not being completely reliable, that sort of lets me say, well, maybe the other things are more reliable and more lasting, the kingdom that cannot be shaken, to use a scriptural sort of term for it.
Yeah.
But it is unseen things, you know, that's what makes it a wager, because there are unseen things that you're saying you depend on, and there is suffering. And, you know, the incarnation says that God himself suffered and died on the cross. God did not avoid the suffering, but passed through it, even died from it.
Right.
So you've got the whole thing to be set in this place where you're given this gift of the wager. The wager itself seems to be kind of a hint, but I don't think that it's ever going to be not a wager. You know, it's not going to be proven. And I think with young Earth creationism, I was trying to kind of make it so I could cook the books on the wager. You know, like I could find the evidence that other people were overlooking, that because it was scientific, I could force someone to believe in God.
Right.
I could force someone to see that the earth is really only a couple thousand years old, you know, that there's flaws in the science. And that just, it wasn't fun anymore after a certain point. That's part of the thing. There was no joy to it for me, because I was getting down to these arcana of trying to prove that the species never could have evolved to each other, that they could, that the dates that we get from the chemistry, and that's, by the way, my corner of the whole debate, is the age of the earth.
Right.
It's very clear to me chemically that, you know, the science leads me there. So I was sort of brought into science hoping I could use it to sort of, you know, force people to believe like me in one way.
Right.
And then I ended up finding out, well, you know, the way I believed is actually not necessarily the way that the whole church believed. It sort of was based on some assumptions about how I read the Bible and even what the early church theologians said. Yes. When I got back to Aquinas and I got back to Augustine and I got back to Jesus, you start to realize, oh, okay, this is talking about the true bedrock of reality being what God gave as a gift. And I can't use science to sort of force someone to believe in God. But I can have fun with science, and I can see the joy that God had in creating. And by the way, you know, why am I so hung up on how long the days were or how long things took? Because that really is a secondary question. I wasn't around to be bored, you know, and God doesn't get bored. So why am I projecting my own issues onto God rather than saying, take me where you will, show me how you created, starting from the assumption that you created.
Well, one of the things in that was really fascinating is how, and I think this is I've read enough of science and religion, science and theology to make this statement, at least provisionally. It is unique that you really look at the periodic table. I mean, as the core datum or set of data for how you do your faith and science work. And that's really profound. It's a fresh look at how to bring these two things together. So I'm going to ask a real softball pitch question, I think, but maybe it's extremely slow softball pitch. Can you just make sure we all understand, who are listening and hearing this, what is the periodic table, and then why is it so profound for you?
Well, one of the other things from my history is I only ever played t-ball, and I wasn't very good at it. So I'm going to try to hit this pitch.
Yeah, right. It'll be a t-ball quote pitch, right?
right. So, but the thing about the periodic table, okay, the ancient Greeks thought that there were 4 elements that you could break things down into. And they were almost right, because there's a limited number of elements. There's really only a couple dozen naturally occurring elements. And they all come to, you can learn in chemistry class about how they're related to each other. But the really amazing thing is all of the phenomena around us can be explained by breaking it down to these not 4, but 90 elements, or whatever the number is naturally occurring. And even beyond that, the fact that we have a limited number of elements, each of them has their own personality, which, by the way, comes from the shapes of their electron orbitals. And you can actually trace a lot of it down to the physics of charges moving around each other.
Wow.
And even quantum mechanics and stuff like that. So you get into really cool physics. But the thing about chemistry is that all of these atoms, they are arranged in octaves. And that's actually a word that they used historically.
The music of the spheres, as it were. I mean, the older theologians in the Renaissance talked about the music of the spheres. That came right to mind as you talked about the octaves. I'm sorry, I interrupted your flow, but that was exciting to hear that.
Yeah, that's exactly and one of the things is at one level of the periodic table, you get repeating patterns when you have 8 elements.
Right.
Now, there's different patterns, but they are musical, and it does go down to the fact that electrons are waves in part, and they have to act a little bit like waves of sound. Okay, I'm really going, I don't want to get into all the chemistry and all the ways in which I have to qualify that statement.
Right.
But it
That's
really
right.
is
Leave it there.
fundamental.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah. Music is fundamental, and music has always been fundamental for me. You know, it's the other part of my life that I always really resonated with was the music growing up, and the church music, and so there's all sorts of.
That musical aspect of life, to use that metaphor, resonates in your own work. And I mean, I'm thinking of Galileo, who was an amazing lute player, apparently. You know what I mean?
Like, I didn't know that.
And Pythagoras, way before him, believed that music, because of its mathematical structure, was so central to the structure of the universe. Of course, that's been played out through Copernicus, et cetera. I want to move to COVID-19 in a minute, but I got one last question on your book, because I think it's really helpful. You move toward the end of the book, and you take, I hope take on is fair enough. You take on the idea from the great scientist Stephen Jay Gould that if we played the tape of natural history backwards, played it again, it wouldn't come out with the same conclusion. And you say, well, maybe, but probably not. It depends on this idea of hermeneutics to some degree. So tell me how you end and how you engage with Gould in the last chapters of this book.
Yeah, Gould is a paleontologist, and he looked at the data, and he looked at all the forms of animals that you could get in the fossil record. And he concluded that there was no rhyme or reason to the forms that he would get, and therefore there was no rhyme or reason to life. And that's why he titled his book Wonderful Life. Now that's a new argument based on new data, but it's based on old philosophical foundations. It's based on Epicureanism. Is basically the argument that Gould is making is a very old argument, and it says that the most important thing is atoms and void, that the atoms are just colliding in the void, and that the gods are far away, they don't really care, sort of a deist or even agnostic atheist kind of way of looking at things.
Yeah.
And it resonates a lot with scientists when you put it that way. And when you look at certain levels, like when you look at the levels that have more randomness that we don't understand, it's a valid thing, just like it was valid for the Greeks long ago. But Paul spoke against it on Mars Hill in the book of Acts, and Christianity has sort of opposed itself to some of the conclusions of Epicureanism. So in a sense, it's a very old debate that's coming around again. And we're not really saying too much new. It's just that we've collected more data, and then we end up having the same philosophical debate.
Right.
But I really do think that we shouldn't assume that Epicureanism is the default philosophy of science.
Right.
It never really has been, and it's a valid choice, but there's other sides to the wager if we want to return to that. So what I'm trying to do is sort of bring Christian theology implicitly into the idea of what is the order of the universe, and the order of the periodic table, the even musical order of it, led to order to biological evolution and an order to mineral evolution. That's one of the things that astonished me when I was researching the book. I had no idea that there was actually a thing called mineral evolution.
Right.
The whole world is dynamically changing and evolving in a certain way. Lots of nuance to talk about there, but I just want to say, scientists don't have to be Epicureans, and there's even some wisdom from the Epicureans that we can probably take. Paul spoke to those people on Mars Hill. But if you look historically, there's a lot of scientists who did what they did because they were motivated to look for the underlying harmonies and the underlying music of the spheres, you know?
Right.
And actually a lot of the founding chemists were that way. You can look at a lot of the Maxwell and the 19th century. Yeah. And so the question is, when you look at that, a lot of times people were like, well, that was in the water. You know, they didn't really believe that. Their science was not really related to their faith.
Right.
I would object to that. And I think that the idea of the logos, the idea of the universe being spoken into existence by logos, which is a repeating pattern that we can understand.
Right. And
part of that is related to the fact that God incarnated himself in creation as one of us.
Right.
There's a lot of theology there, but it leads to the idea of there are layers at which we can find order and even purpose. And there are layers where it's harder to see. I think Gould looked just too closely, because of his field, he looked too closely at some layers where he was looking at the things that aren't fundamental. And I think that the periodic table, the organization and order of that, leads to an organization and order to even the messy, dynamic nature of creation.
Right.
And like I said, I find chemistry to be fun. Yeah. And so when I look at that, my first reaction is, oh, that's fun. You know, that might not be the ordinary reaction of everyone, but I want to try to communicate why I'm saying that and why I think looking for an order in the universe can actually be a fruitful way to do science, and possibly the original way that science developed when you look at the people who actually put those things together. Boyle is another example.
I mean, there's that long historical argument that's been made by people like Alfred North Whitehead and Herbert Butterfield, that the rise of modern science in Europe was related specifically to the doctrine of creation, as you described. There's a creator who makes us, who's understandable, that in a world that we can actually observe, but have to observe, because it's made out of God's own freedom and creativity. Well, I want to veer from this. You said the world we have is chaotic, right? And at some level, and we find order in it. So there's a chaotic world we're living in right now with COVID-19, you know, moving through our planet, putting us with stay-at-home and shelter-in-place. And of course, we reached a milestone. At least I heard of the milestone yesterday on the news of 1 million cases of COVID-19 that are in the United States that have been, you know, verified. Who knows exactly about that number? So maybe you could first describe for us, I believe this connects, help me out if it does not, but the structure of COVID-19, the corona itself, is a part of how it's effective as a virus. Can you describe that chemical structure and how, or that the structure of the virus and how it works in terms of creating a disease within, you know, the host, as it were?
Sure. Viruses are definitely incomplete in themselves. There's a question as to whether it's possible to even say it's alive. And by the way, if you see,
I found that out the other day. That was fascinating. Right? Sorry, I'm interrupting you, but that like, it's neither alive nor dead. It's like the Nazgul in Lord of the Rings or something.
Yeah, I never thought of that before, but they certainly have had part of their life is definitely bound up in another. You know, and that's the way that viruses are. They can't replicate themselves. They have to hijack the cell's replication machinery. And basically they have just a computer program, if you want to use that metaphor. That's what the RNA is in the coronavirus. And it's literally a language. That's why I find the logos representation of creation to be applicable not just to chemistry, but to biology, because you have these words and they are literally one-dimensional strings of chemicals made up of repeating a limited set of letters that repeat themselves in patterns that we can understand. At least we can understand individually what the individual letters say. But as for the meaning of the entire string of RNA, that's a little bit more tricky, right? You know, what does this string of RNA mean? Why is this string of RNA so bad when another one causes the common cold?
Yeah.
Because that's the case for coronaviruses. So because we can understand that, and we can actually talk about it like a computer program, has its ups and downs as a metaphor, but we can take the whole thing, and I can represent the entire viral genome to you, all the RNA in it, with a 30,000 character file, very small file, relatively speaking. And I can put that up on the screen, and we can see how it changes. Because the virus changes, it uses our own replication machinery, which we understand how that works. We can understand also why it makes mistakes and it makes typos in replicating itself. And those typos can then persist because if they aren't edited out by natural selection or whatever, then they persist, and we can look at those and we can understand, we can make a guess how big is the pool of viruses, how fast is this mutating, and how much, where should we put our efforts into beating it? My hope is that eventually we'll be able to come up with the structure of the proteins. We've already got the structure of the proteins of the virus, but now we want to come up with pharmaceuticals that will fit into that structure and sort of jam up and sabotage the works, okay?
Yeah, last night I heard on the news they take that corona, structure, a little crown, and it's almost like you fit a kind of covering to it so it can't attach in some ways to our cells, which I'm sure it's simplified, but I love that image of how to combat this and what a solution to this might be.
Yeah. The word sabotage, I use that deliberately, and actually that's a Star Trek reference.
Okay, good.
I don't know if you're enough to, Star Trek 6, one of the characters describes how sabotage comes from the Dutch word for the wooden sabot shoe, and they would stick it into the gears of the machinery when they were upset about the Industrial Revolution.
Oh my goodness.
So anyways, even that was formed by my formative Star Trek.
There you go with
experience.
Star Trek, yeah.
You don't get that from Star Wars. You get that from Star Trek.
Unfortunately, this is true. Okay, I have to do one last question. I'm sorry if I'm cutting you off a little bit, but I want to do one last question before we go to the questions from the broader, audience, as it were. And it's an important question, I think, where you stand. There have been 3 primary ways that faith and science, Christian faith and science, is connected or not connected. One is conflict, they're at odds. One is independence. They talk about different things. And then there's the third, which you can call dialogue or integration or collaboration. And you embody that kind of dialogue and integration in your work. So as a scientist in the church, is there a particular message you believe the church can bring during this COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah. Well, the church has always been about crisis. In a sense, the word crisis, we even pray, lead me not into crisis, is one of the ways you can translate the Lord's Prayer. And so the church has tools. The church has been through crisis before, and we know how to depend on God in a crisis. So I think the church has a lot to offer in crisis. And one of the things is to make sure that we're really depending on God and not our projection or model or idol of what we think God should be doing. Okay. When I look at the whole issue of what the church has to offer, I think that what I've been talking about with the idea that science is a gift to us from God that we can use to get past our own wrong conclusions and wrong assumptions about the world, to get to the way things are actually going to work. I think that can fit into a theology of how do we respond to the crisis and how do we respond with the tools of science to sort of the atoms of the virus, right? But then the virus has a huge effect on the other levels of reality, which are very important and possibly more important to people who are not chemists like me. You've got the social levels, you've got the spiritual levels of reality. So the church has a lot to offer in how to behave like Christ in these situations. And the important thing to see, Christ would answer questions, and he would debate things, right? He would debate, but he wouldn't always answer the questions. And sometimes, he suffered through the cross, even though that didn't make any sense. He followed where God led him.
Mhm.
And I think that there's a sense in which I was hoping that this virus would be no big deal when it started. It turned out to be a bigger deal than I expected.
Wow.
And the tools of science were a way that God would speak to us to say, this is a bigger deal. You prayed not to be led into the time of temptation or crisis. Well, the answer to that right now is no. We're in a time of crisis. And so the question is, how can we look to Christ, and how can we follow his example in how he dealt with the different crises of his situation? How can we pour ourselves out for others? How can we be generous like God is generous, and not be fearful, not be afraid, but also not be overconfident, and not be saying, oh, the church is just gonna be completely healthy through all this. The church has been there through the plagues, and the people in the church have gotten sick and died.
Right.
And so with science, we can figure out what tools we can use to minimize that. But the church can give us the more important things, the directions that we should go, and how we should trust God in this, just like in the crisis that I had going up, the economic crisis. We're probably going to have some kind of economic crisis now.
Yeah.
The only thing I can say is, looking back on my own history, I've seen how God carried us through that local crisis in my own life when the space shuttle exploded. And I'm drawing on that now. It's one of the reasons why it's one of the reasons why I have confidence when I wonder, I look back on that time, and we can see all the times that God has been with the church in the suffering, not by taking it away or giving them a miracle drug right away, but by suffering with us through it, and by being with us in the whole situation.
There's that great quote from Soren Kierkegaard that life must be lived forwards, but it is understood backwards.
Yes.
Hey, I know Dan has some questions for us. I believe he's going to come on and ask them to us.
Hey guys, thank you for that really stimulating conversation. Great to see two people who are really embedded in this conversation about faith and science. Just go back and forth and I think show us all a way of thinking about faith and science that is very constructive. We do have some Q&A questions. I encourage any of the people watching, you can continue to type those in to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. First question, Ben, what is your motivation in writing about science for non-scientists? And sort of connected to that, what is your process for taking high-level specialized concepts and bringing them to a more broader common language and audience?
Mm-hmm. My purpose is I want to communicate some of the fun I find in chemistry, and that's actually one of my purposes in teaching. I always like to, one of the things on my shelf behind me, I have a lot of demos, and I have like cigarette lighters, and I have like marble toys and things like that. There is a sense of fun that you can get, and at the same time, of course, chemistry is not typically the most fun for everyone. I want to try to find out how to communicate some of the fun that I have in chemistry and some of the amazing things that we can do by taking atoms apart and putting them back together. So that's sort of my motivation, to explain and to communicate the fun that I have in science. And also, it goes together with the motivation to tell people about this gift that God has given us. And God's given all of us the gift of life and perception and the choice that we have for how we're going to answer Pascal's wager. And I think that this world, exploring this world, is kind of opening up the gift that God gave. So there's even a theological sort of underlying reason for that, finding the harmonious structures in science that motivated so many scientists for so long. And finding those even in the place that I was told there was no harmonious structure in evolution. And yeah, it's living, messy, and dynamic, but I do see some harmonious structures in it. And I found that to be really fun. So it's one of the things I try to communicate and that tries to motivate me. The way I sort of process it is I teach. My book actually started off as a physical chemistry class. And I found this thinker, R.J.P. Williams, who probably should have been given a Nobel Prize, but didn't get one. But I found the story that he wrote about evolution in chemistry. And then I wanted to explain that to people. So I explained it to my physical chemistry students. Then I'm like, well, why don't I explain this at a, with words, at a chapter by chapter? It takes a lot of time because I found the first time I explain anything, I explain it badly, but the good news about, it's not good news for the students who are in that first class, right? But I learn and I do it better the next year because the science does stay the same and it's proved over time and I explain it better. And I think that subconsciously you end up explaining things better the more you try to explain them over and over again. So it's that iterative process, and the most important practical part of it is to give myself time and to realize my first draft is going to stink, and that's okay, but give myself time to think about it, take long walks, let it sort of cogitate. And it's like, I do crossword puzzles, and sometimes you're stuck on a clue, and then you go away, and then you look back at that clue, and immediately you see what it was. It's like your brain was working on it, the part you can't control. And I think there is a lot to that. It's a little bit of relying on God to let your subconscious work for you when you've been trying as hard as you can. So I think that's the practical way that I end up explaining these things, and it comes out in my classes, and then the book is kind of an extension of that.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I just, as someone who is not a chemist at all, I'm a historian of religion by training. I really appreciate in your book, you use a lot of metaphors to talk about the chemical world, the sort of the microscopic chemical world, which can seem or molecular world, which can seem very abstract or unclear even how to imagine it if you're not steeped in that field. And you use a lot of good, you talk about buildings and connection points and roads and all these really concrete metaphors to help the uninitiated do that. At least in your book, that's what you do. I'm assuming you do that with your students as well. So that's another way that, just thinking as you're talking, that I've seen you do that in your work.
It's all
okay, this is a question for both of you, I think. How would you respond to a Christian believer who thinks social distancing indicates a lack of faith in God?
Greg, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think what's happening when a person wants to reject social distancing as because it shows a lack of faith, is it's in many ways improperly relating what faith means to faith in God to the understanding that faith has, that God gives us wisdom as human beings that we can use. So I wouldn't, put our faith in some kind of test with God. Like, why would we want to tempt God and test God by being in, risky situations? It's possible that God could save me if I jumped off, an 80-foot building, and it would show my faith, but it's probably unlikely. And I would be better to learn from what we know from nature, from what we call science, etc. So I think it comes down to, how do we see God working? And I think you touched on this earlier, Ben. It's this idea that God works through natural causes as well as sometimes unilaterally, like with the resurrection. This is called philosophically dual causation. And so when we read in the scripture in Psalm 139 that God knitted us in our mother's womb, God uses processes that we can understand as natural through science, as the elements of nature that God has created. And when science tells us things that are naturally true, we do well to follow them. So science is now telling us social distancing is important. Even more, that social distancing isn't just for me, and this is the most important point, but is to fulfill Jesus's command to love our neighbor so that we won't infect our neighbor. And we need to do it not just because it's honestly a self-oriented thing, but because it's an other-oriented thing, living out the ethics of Jesus. And it's science as a part of understanding God's creation that leads us to be able to love people better. So I would see it as a way of a faithful person who believes in this great God that has given us this insight, that now through faith we respond out of love to distance ourselves socially for this particular time.
Yeah. And I would add on to that, the theological image I get, you get the kind of this image of God is transcendent and above creation and breaks into creation to save his people. And that definitely happens. God decides when that happens.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm disturbed by the fact that the most essential things to me have been categorized as non-essential activities by people that, and I disagree with that categorization. And so I think it's important to communicate that and to realize that these things are essential, but sometimes God takes them away. And for right now, what we see is we have this law of diffusion. If somebody sneezes, the virus goes from one person to another, and it's highly contagious. It's more contagious than I thought. So with that in mind, I don't hear God calling me to make a stand. And it does seem an awful lot like, and the voice is saying, make a stand for God by not social distancing. That's exactly the same argument, like you talked about throwing yourself off a high building. That's exactly the same argument that Satan made to Jesus, and Jesus said no.
Right.
So I think that the image I want to get is we have this natural image of God and nature kind of in conflict. But the image I've been introduced to lately is the image of the burning bush, where you have the bush that Moses saw was on fire but not consumed, and it was holy ground. God was speaking and was present through that bush. And the idea that inside of nature, God can sort of set it on fire and speak from inside it, and yet not consume it, because God does not compete with his creation. God can speak through it as well as against it, and like stopping the creation to, for example, resurrect the body of Jesus. I mean, it's very clear that you have God that can do whatever God wants. But listening for the voices right now, the voices that I'm hearing saying that we shouldn't do social distancing because these are essential activities, I don't agree. I don't hear God speaking through that to us. So I would agree with that, with you, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you both. A little more lighthearted maybe, for both Ben and Greg, what's one book that has shaped your thinking? Or if someone were to ask, sort of, what is the most important book, besides the Bible, we'll grant that, that has shaped your thinking? How would you answer? Maybe Greg, go first.
So I'm going to cheat on this one. I'll tell you a book, and out of that book, what was another important book for that author. So Francis Collins's The Language of God, I think, is the book that I recommend first for people to read, just because he's such a leader in our country, especially right now, as the head of the National Institutes of Health. And he does such a good job of bringing a theological depth, a philosophical depth, which is with his incredible scientific skills. So The Language of God looks at DNA particularly, which is Collins's specialization, and describes how that is the language of God. He also founded the organization Biologos, of which I've been involved. I'm on an advisory council. So I've really enjoyed his influence in this field. Now, Collins was also converted as a medical student at age 28 by Mere Christianity. So we have to mention that book, because almost every scientist and intellectual I've ever talked to, especially those who've come to faith, have been influenced by Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And I think it's not because Lewis was a scientist, but because he helped us understand how reason and rationality, that is such a part of the scientific work, can connect with our faith as Christians. So Collins, and also Collins as he loved Mere Christianity, if I can do that. So it's 1A and 1B.
That'll work. And I actually have my books right here.
I love the fact that we get to see into Ben's office.
Yes.
Yeah, I tried to clean off, and then we have all this light. The sun's actually out in Seattle, and I'm just not prepared for this. So I've kind of tried to rotate away from that. But now I can show you this. Okay, so I have to say 2 books too, because you can't ask for one book from something like this. And actually, depending on the day, I will say a lot of different books. R.J.P. Williams' book, really hard to read even for me, but that really did introduce me to the whole idea of chemical evolution. But this is one, this is reversed, but I guess it's kind of like Gödel Escherbach. This taught me how computers work. but it also taught me about the words at the heart of creation. When I talked about how viruses work, there's a part in there about viruses. And if you want to talk about how are these bound together by the logos, Hofstadter does not use the categories of logos. He's not a theologian, and he's sort of a popular science writer. But as far as expressing the logos, I think it'd be fascinating. I don't know if anybody's ever like written something about how the logos is expressed in it, how computers work, how viruses work, how words work, and how music works, because you've got Bach as well. But theologically, this is The Moral Vision of the New Testament by Richard B. Hayes. And so, Dan, I think have you heard of this book?
Yes, yes.
This is fantastic. And when I was reading this, he goes through the scripture and then he moves to ethics, like how should we behave on certain ways? And he warns you, don't skip to the end where I talk about ethics before you go through where I interpret the Gospels and scripture first. When I was reading that, I was thinking the rationality that he's using to apply to scripture to come up with deductions, how should we act morally? That was fully recognizable to me as a scientist. You're not running repeatable experiments on things you can take apart, but you're reading the ancient words that go together in this way that Greg sort of talked about, the way that the faith sort of sees these things cohering together. And so I recognized a scientific, or I guess I should say a rationality, a logos-driven kind of ideas for reasoning and making decisions that I would call Richard B. Hayes an honorary scientist that just works with the lab notebooks of the ancient Israelites and the way that John Polkinghorne actually described scripture as the lab notebooks of people who have lived long ago. And I think that's valid. So those are the two books that came to mind for me.
Great, thank you. Those are I read Gödel, Escher, Bach as an undergrad, I believe, and it's a good one for undergrad. It really opens your mind to a lot of new intellectual terrain for sure. Okay, we're running out of time. I just wanted to ask each of you a sort of a final question. I'll go to Greg first and then to Ben. Maybe leaving us with something to look forward to in this challenging time. And I wondered if each of you, maybe Greg for the church and Ben more for the scientific community, if each of you could point to an area of hope in the church, in the scientific community, in this time of crisis, and in particularly sort of in response to what have you been, as you've been observing how the church has reacted to the pandemic and how the scientific community has been acting, what's something that we can cheer for or follow with anticipation in the news as we're reading more and more about this that can give us some glimmer of hope?
Dan, that's a great question. In addition to the time I've spent in the academic world, I have served as a pastor for 20 years. And so how the church responds is incredibly important in this time. I can just give a couple of vignettes. The first is having actually met Francis Collins a couple times. Whenever he addresses this crisis, or Anthony Fauci is one of actually he supervises Anthony Fauci. Whenever I see them, I think of people who are using their science just to give us a way to connect and to respond to this virus, thoughtfully. That gives me great hope. The second thing is this weird world we're living in with stay at home has produced some really interesting things. I've been on Zoom calls that have now been able to include people who couldn't hear well or people who couldn't drive at night. I've seen time spent walking with families in my area. And so there's a hope to that as well. But I would probably highlight most of all those people who've moved out into caring for those who are hurting, who are shut-ins. My wife works with the homeless in our city, has been creating masks for people to give them as a sign of hope. They're kind of fanciful sometimes. And of course, our first responders and our medical community that goes directly into places, especially those who do it with a deep sense of faith. That to me is a sign of hope, because we recognize that we're always living in the midst of death. That's a reality of being in this world. It's particularly focused right now And I think it's the Christians who recognize the power of the resurrection in this time who demonstrate the goodness of Christ and his gospel to us. So that's where I find the deepest hope of all, is when it's embodied in God's people through acts of compassion.
Yeah, and when I look at the science, every time that we can put a number on something reliably and we can see what happens and we can look at the data, that's a little bit of control that's been given to us in a situation that is completely out of our control. So I think that the cooperation and the openness where I can get that data from someone else, and then I can plot it out on my graph, and then I can show it to someone else, and we can try to communicate what's actually going on with the virus. That kind of cooperation and communication is a big part of hope. There's a lot of, the virus is just atoms, and we are smarter than atoms in some cases, where we can put together a fragment of a drug that can fit into that and block it off and sabotage it. So I do have hope about that. We've already got crystal structures. Crystal structures usually take, this is my field of protein science. Usually it takes months to years to get a crystal structure. We had one within a month of the virus hitting the US that we had, and I could actually go with my students and we could try to fit old drugs that have already been FDA approved into that virus. Even those are at best going to be just one part of a multifaceted strategy against it. But where I can, the parts that I can understand lead me to the hope that there will be more understanding, and seeing that we have a lot of tools that can be put toward this. The flip side of that is that the virus was kind of caused and spread by globalization, social practices, and things like that. So there's a sense in which we're coming up against our limits, as physical limits as a species, when we transmit this virus and things like that. So we have to turn to the virtues of humility and maybe where we can cut back. We are not, there's a book that came out called Homo Deus instead of Homo sapiens, suggesting that we are like mini gods. And one of the things it said is that now we can conquer plagues. Plagues are not a problem anymore. Well, that book's wrong. But the thing about that, we can actually use the tools that God gave us within the understanding that many things of this are going to be out of our control. And there's going to be some realities of suffering that we cannot avoid. But within the limits, the carefully prescribed limits of what science can do, I see a lot of hope for being able to beat this virus. We have seen coronaviruses before. Viruses are hard to beat back, but it's possible. And that's the hope I get. I always want to put that hope in the broader context of not just science.
Great, thank you both. The note of humility and dependence on God is a great place to end our conversation today. So thank you so much, Ben, for sharing your work and your thoughts.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. Yeah.
Thanks, and thank you, Greg, for hosting the conversation and for adding your own unique and helpful insights as well.
Thanks. Really great to be part of this.
Great, and thank you everyone for attending.